Hello, everyone. So welcome to week one of the course on fundamentals of educational dialogue. And this week we're looking at a key theorist, which many of you will be familiar with, Professor Robin Alexander, and his work on educational dialogue. So Professor Alexander has been working in this field for like decades now, and his work has developed over time. But he's known really well for the principles of dialogic teaching and the repertoires, and a new term which I think kind of encapsulates a lot of his work about dialogic stance. So we're going to be focusing on these things in an interview with him. But I'm going to start off by asking Professor Alexander to just talk a little bit about his work on educational dialogue.
Right. Well, it starts, I suppose, in the mid-80s with classroom research, which I was doing, and that's when I first started recording and analysing classroom interaction and becoming aware that in the primary classrooms where I was working, the range of talk which one saw was somewhat limited, and it was, of course, dominated by what people call recitation, closed question, recall answer, and minimal feedback. And then I embarked on a huge comparative project working in Russia, France, India, England, and the United States, and became immediately aware from all the video material, observation, and interviews which I did there that there is a much wider range of possibilities available should we be prepared to look for them and learn from them. Now, when I say learn from them, I don't mean do what politicians do, which is to say, right, let's copy that practice. I mean, try and understand the principles underlying what we see and admire, and maybe the principles can be imported and adapted. And out of that came the first iteration of my, what I call dialogic teaching. Regrettably, a number of people have picked up that term, but they used it in different ways. But perhaps you, Farah, can sort that out for everyone. And I developed it as a framework over the next couple of decades, a series of versions, and the final version to date is in a book which was published last year called A Dialogic Teaching Companion. And that consists of, first of all, a clear definition of what dialogic teaching is about. Secondly, a stance, we can say more on that. Thirdly, a set of justifications. Fourthly, a set of principles which guide one's practice. Fifthly, and very, very importantly, a large range of repertoires. And the notion of repertoire, for me, goes back to my work on a government inquiry in 1991 too, which was called the Three Wise Men Inquiry. We didn't call it that, but others did, where we advanced the notion that teaching really shouldn't be a matter of choosing this method as opposed to that, in which everything is dichotomized, traditional, progressive, and so on, but understanding that a good teacher has a broad repertoire of skills at his or her command and deploys them according to circumstance and need. And that notion of repertoire is absolutely fundamental to my approach to dialogic teaching. The approach in its penultimate form to date, at the invitation of the Education Endowment Foundation, a major body which subjects promising teaching methods to randomized controlled trial. It was subjected to randomized controlled trial, a very large one involving 5,000 primary school students, with a successful outcome. And my framework was used, and I also designed the professional development program for it, working with Frank Hardman at York University. And after only 20 weeks of immersion in dialogic teaching, the pupils in the intervention group, that's those who'd experienced dialogic teaching, intensively taught, were 3 months ahead of the control group, their control group peers, in tests of English, maths, and science. So after a relatively brief immersion, sorry, it's 2 months, after a relatively brief immersion, we could see it really making a difference. And it made a difference not just to the children, but also to their teachers. So that's where we are now. So it's been a long process. It's gradually been developing, changing, modifying. And I suppose if there's a characteristic of the current approach is there's much more emphasis on argumentation and the importance of dialogue for democratic engagement and citizenship. And it won't surprise you to learn that one of the things that has driven that is the fact that we appear to be in an era of what they call post-truth. Anything goes. Politicians seem to have a rather dubious relationship with the truth themselves. So it becomes tremendously important that we help children to argue, to understand argument, to probe the arguments of others, and also apply tests of truth to what they see and hear.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm very pleased that you've talked about not just the learning gains that can be achieved through educational dialogue or dialogic teaching, but also the more sort of broader social aims or broader sort of human aims, if you like, or what we might want to achieve as educators. Now, when you're talking about the Education Endowment Fund trial, what we're seeing there, the impact of the intervention that you did, I'm wondering how much of that is due to the underlying principles and the kind of engagement with those ideas and the theory that underpins dialogic teaching, as opposed to sort of like do's and don'ts that teachers might follow in the classroom?
I think if I'm honest, it's both. The more successful teachers really did get inside what we were trying to do. I mean, we trained them, obviously. But in the end, because of this principle of repertoire and the notion is that in the end it's the teacher who must decide because the teacher knows his or her circumstances, we don't. They still use their own judgment in terms of how they applied the repertoire, but always in accordance with the principles, which they did sign up to, as did their schools. Principles like the notion that learning is best conceived as a joint, as a collective activity, which is very Vygotskian, obviously. Mm-hmm. The notion that good teaching is supportive, and also pupils learn best when they support each other. They learn from each other. It's reciprocal. And one or two others, which I can say something about, or perhaps you will provide the material for. They did sign up to that, but it is also the case that there were practices which were particularly potent. And having the advantage since we published since our Education Endowment Foundation project was completed, the trial was completed and reported on, another large-scale project based at Cambridge, in which Christine Howe and Neil Mercer and others were involved, has looked itself at what seem to be the most potent points in dialogue that really make a difference. And they've gone for what they call elaborations, which is that when the teacher or even another child asks a question, the pupil responds, and it's at that moment when the teacher says, now, say more about this, or what do you mean by this? Or I don't really think this is the right way to approach it. Why not? And so on. Or who agrees with this? Discourse analysts call this the third turn in a typical exchange. So the first turn typically is a question or a statement by the teacher. The second turn is a response by the pupil. And that's where too much classroom discourse stops. There might be a minimal response from the teacher. And what we've learned from our project, from the big ESRC one, but also from the work of my colleagues Sarah Michaels and Kathy O'Connor in the United States, is that third turn is a very critical moment. Right at the beginning, I read the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, who sees a Russian philosopher who saw everything in dialogic terms. And I frequently quote, I'm afraid to the boredom of people, his saying that if an answer doesn't give rise to a new question from itself, it falls out of the dialogue. Now that is partly a matter of common sense. If you don't do something with somebody's answer, then obviously it falls out of the dialogue. But it has a more profound meaning than that, and particularly in classrooms, because what he can be construed as saying, except he wasn't talking about teachers, but I am, is that if we do nothing with what the pupil says to us, then we miss the opportunity to get inside the pupil's head, to help with their misunderstandings, to build on their understandings, and also to build their confidence as well. So the pupil's answer, there's an awful lot of work that has been done on questions, different kinds of questions to ask, open questions, closed questions, leading questions, discursive questions, narrow questions, broad questions, and so on. Much less work has been done on pupils' responses and contributions, and above all, what we might do with them. And all the research, including the work of John Hattie, his meta-analysis of a large number of projects, all points to the critical importance of the third term. But you can't work with a third term unless you've got other things going on as well, like good questions, like a good climate of discussion, all the rest of it. So it's not just about that. But back to your initial question, which was it the stance? Was it the general approach? Or was it particular kinds of teaching? Certainly our teachers responded to the different repertoires. They thought about how they should ask questions. They thought about how the pupils should be grouped. They thought about matters like thinking time, wait time. You ask a question. If you expect an immediate answer, then what you're saying is this doesn't need thinking about, or indeed it isn't worth thinking about. If you give children time to think, then you're actually dignifying what you're saying and saying, yes, please think about this. So notions like that all rang bells, because in the end, everything that I have proposed, I have seen in classrooms. It's not a novel theory that comes out of the blue. It's not something which is proposed that has never been done before. It's drawing on what many teachers actually do quite instinctively.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I mean, what I took from there's lots and lots to take home points, but some core points is that the work that you've done is drawing on the best practice that you've seen in the classroom, breaking down where that comes from and trying to articulate that for teachers. I've also think it was very significant that you made the point that context matters, and we recognize that all teachers, I mean, this course is an international open course, so we'll have teachers with so many different contexts, and we're trusting the teachers to understand how what they learn in this course might apply to them, where to use it and when not to use it, because not everything will work in every context. So I think that's really significant. And then, you've illustrated about the principles, that the principles give you an ethos, they give you something to understand the underlying thinking behind why creating that ethos works. And ultimately the repertoire is the teacher's sort of toolbox of what they can then go into the classroom with and play around with. So, I mean, you've alluded to a lot of the things I would have talked to you about, but maybe we can sort of close this interview by you really explaining a bit more about this term that you've come to after all these years of work, which is dialogic stance. How might dialogic stance be operationalized by teachers in a range of different settings in their classrooms?
It's actually quite difficult, because in the end it's a matter of belief. It's accepting that a particular point of view is a valid one and an admirable one, which I think it is. You know, Farah, that between 2006 and 2010, I directed England's biggest inquiry ever into primary education, the Cambridge Primary Review, and amongst all the material which we produced and worked on, having talked to all kinds of people, was a set of aims, a proposed set of aims for education. And some of these were concerned with the individual, some with the individual in relation to others, and some with what goes on in classrooms, the teaching process. And one of them was called Enacting Dialogue. And what it did was to build into these aims for education the notion that dialogue pervades everything. And may I read what you said about this? To help students grasp that learning is an interactive process, and that understanding builds through joint activity between teacher and student and among students in collaboration, and thereby to develop students' increasing sense of responsibility for what and how they learn. Now, and I've not finished, that's the first part of enacting dialogue. That's, if you like, about the uniting of the cognitive and the social, which is now a very familiar notion in the world of dialogue and argumentation. But it's also about developing students' increasing sense of responsibility. It's about metacognition. It's about pupils taking control of their own learning. And then we went on to say, to help students recognize that knowledge is not only transmitted, but also negotiated and recreated, that each of us in the end makes our own sense out of the meeting of knowledge, both personal and collective. And that, of course, is diametrically opposed to the traditional notion that the teacher knows and the pupil doesn't. And it's the job of the teacher to hand the knowledge down to the pupil, the empty vessel view of learning. We're saying that everyone has knowledge of some kind. The pupil comes with knowledge from outside school, but also within this domain of knowledge are enormous numbers of different ways of making sense: scientific, artistic, mathematical, historical, geographic, personal, social, and so on. And they are in dialogue with each other. So that's the second sense of the dialogic stance. So the first one is, if you like, the cognitive and social. The second is a view on knowledge. And the third is this: to advance a pedagogy in which dialogue is central between the self and others, between personal and collective knowledge, between present and past, and different ways of making sense. That, I think, is a reasonable summation of my dialogic stance, even though at that stage in the Cambridge Primary Review, I was 3 or 4 iterations behind where I currently am, but I still hold to that. So that's an outlook. It's a way of thinking about the world, way of thinking about knowledge, way of thinking about children, and above all, a way of thinking about teaching and learning.
Thank you so much, Professor Alexander. There's a lot for us to take away and unpack there, and hopefully we'll be doing that, looking at a number of the things that you said as we go through the rest of the few weeks of this course. Thank you.